Hey, so last week I just finished doing a shock install in my front shocks. So that's the one, two, three, four. I've done this 5 times now for some reason. If you're curious why, just comment below. I can make a video on that. But every time it's been just a huge pain in the butt. The KDSS sway bar is ridiculous. Every time I've done it, it's been a huge pain in the butt. So I'm not a mechanic, so I'm doing this on jack stands in my garage. So if anybody else has a GX460 or a 4Runner and wants to figure out how to do a front shock install on a KDSS-equipped truck with as little swearing and energy expenditure as possible, stay tuned. But let's hop into it, see what kind of weird tools can help out with this. I guess for starters, I've seen some videos suggesting that you need to open the shutter valves on the KDSS system to allow the free flow of fluid in those KDSS rams. You don't need to do this on the 4Runner or the GX460. They have a solenoid that will open up and allow that flow of fluid. Whereas on the 200 series, on that truck, you do need to open those shutter valves to allow the free flow of fluid, so your ram doesn't extend and can't go back in, but this will save you a step and a little bit of time. To be clear, I tried opening the shutter valves last time I did a shock install on the front of the 4Runner, and it made no difference, so yeah, my recommendation is to just skip that step. So you've got the truck up on jack stands, you've taken the wheels off. First step to do is to take off that 10mm bolt holding the ABS line onto the upper control arm. Next, for KDSS trucks, I've found that the most efficient way to get that front shock out is to release the upper control arm, release the tie rod, and release the sway bar, the KDSS bar. With those 3 things out of the way and a little bit of leverage, you should be able to get that front shock out even if it's an extended coilover. You're going to want to use needle nose pliers to pull that cotter pin off the upper control arm. And then you're going to want to use, I've found flush cutters work best for leveraging off those split cotter pins. So that brings us to our first weird tool, and that is these ATC hammer nuts. So the concept with these is they're made out of a material kind of like an impact socket, so it's meant to be whaled on pretty good. You just screw this onto the end of your ball joint thread, and then you can hit this with regular normal hammer that you'd use to drive nails, or I went out and I got a cheap air hammer from Harbor Freight. You can take your air hammer nozzle, just ram it through there. I've got a pretty small air compressor. I think it's like a 2-gallon, 2 cubic foot per minute. I'd probably go bigger than that if I were shopping for an air compressor. So get the biggest air compressor that's not going to be a burden to keep in your garage or your shop, wherever you're going to keep it. And then get the biggest air hammer that'll match up with whatever compressor you've got. I've done the technique where you take a hammer or a mallet and you're wailing on the flats on the side of the ball joint, and yeah, it'll come out eventually, but it makes a huge amount of noise and takes a huge amount of energy. There's not like a clear arc that you can swing that hammer in because you're kind of working in a wheel well. So yeah, these ATC hammer nuts have been working out great. This one is the M14 by 1.5 if you're just after one of them. I got the whole set because it was on Prime overnight, so I've got the whole set of them now. Oh, I'll also mention that I've used the pickle forks or the clamp style ball joint separators, and both of those really tore up the grease boot on that ball joint, so not interested in using those if there's a faster and better way to do it without tearing up the ball joint. So we've got our upper control arm off, we've got our tie rod off. The next step is to pull off the sway bar. And that brings us to our next not super obvious tool, and that is the drift pin. So this is like a 8 or 9 inch drift pin, and there's a little notch at the top of the bracket that holds the KDSS sway bar on. And what you're going to want to do is shove this into that notch, and there's a little hole on the lower control arm, and this will hold that bracket in place as you're backing out the bolts, and that'll keep the bolts from galling on the way out and damaging the threads. So this will also keep control of that sway bar. It's under quite a bit of tension, so it's not going to pop out at you or anything. Then the next step is to lever down, use the force of the drift pin leveraging out that bracket to unhook the bottom of that bracket that holds the sway bar bushing in place. Next, it's time to get the shock out. So there's going to be 3 14mm bolts on the top of that shock. I think they're actually 15mm if you have the Westcott Designs kit, so keep that in mind. But you're going to want a ratcheting box end wrench for the back bolt on there, because it's really hard to get to that one. There's not a whole lot of clearance, so ratcheting 14 or 15mm, and shorter is better in this case. So next you're going to want to take out that 19mm lower shock bolt, and this will take us to our next kind of weird tool. While I was at Harbor Freight, I came across this guy. So it's just a pry bar, again kind of the drift pin concept here with a tapered end on it. But you're going to want to take this, and there's a hole in the lower control arm that you can shove this into and get really good leverage to help push down on that lower control arm, and that should help pop the shock out. I had to get my drift pin behind the shock and force that lower connection out, but this will give you enough space, along with taking off the upper control arm, tie rod, and sway bar ends. If that 19mm lower shock bolt is giving you some trouble trying to get it out, definitely give it a little tap with the drift pin, or if it's really in there, you can take that air hammer again and tippy tap that guy out. So now I've got some bonus tips for the Westcott Designs TRD Pro Fox Shock lower coil perch lift, and that's a mouthful. So if you've got pre-made shocks, you've got Fox, Icon, Old Man Emu, whatever, pre-made shocks that are going in, you can skip ahead to
10 minutes, 13 seconds.
If you've watched their video, you're going to compress the coil, take off that top hat, and then you're going to need to remove the stock TRD lower coil perch. For me, I tried using a mallet, like a dead blow hammer, and that was not getting it off. So I started using just a regular steel-headed hammer, and that was getting me somewhere. And then I also used my air hammer as backup. I kind of figured these perches are just going on the shelf, so I don't care if they get a little ugly. Maybe go bigger on the mallet. I think I had like a 2-pound dead blow, so maybe you can get something bigger and not do as much damage to the lower perch with something like that. So that brings us to the weirdest tool of them all. My shock body, when I measured it, it was 66.03 millimeters, and then the inner diameter of the Westcott Designs shock collar was 66.06 millimeters. And man, it was not going on there, even with like using the mallet. So I called up Westcott Designs and said, "Hey guys, this seems really tight. What's the deal here?" And they said, "Hey, try cooling down the shock body and heating up the collar." So I put the shock body outside. Luckily, it was like 27 degrees out when I did this. And then I put the coil in this Hot Logic. So it looks like a little lunchbox, but inside there's like a hot plate in there. And so that'll heat up the contents of this to, I think I measured it at like almost 190 degrees, so it gets pretty hot in there. So that was perfect. I left the collar in there for almost an hour to really heat up and heat soak and expand. And then with the shock outside, it was contracting. And man, yeah, that made a huge difference. So this Hot Logic is fairly affordable. I think they're around 20-30 bucks or something. You might have seen them on the channel. We'll heat up leftovers or frozen meals in this. Or in this case, a lower coil perch to get it onto the shock. So multi-use tool there. And to really seat that collar in on the shock body, Westcott Designs suggests that you use like a shop press or a vise, and then hammer on the shock in the vise to get the collar seated. My vise is outside, and it was 27 degrees, and it's not really set up to have like a tall shock coming out of it, so went to Home Depot, got a little bit of section 40 3-inch inner diameter PVC pipe. This was just like a 2-foot length of it, and ran the shock body into there. The collar stopped it, and then just tapped on the lower shock mount to get that collar seated. So this worked out. If you don't have a vise that's set up to do this kind of stuff, run to Home Depot, grab one of these, go at it with a hammer. So once you've got that lower collar on, the reassembly of the shock is pretty straightforward. So now comes the fun part. We're going to start putting the shock back in. You're going to want to feed that shock up into the perch again and put 2 of those 14 or 15 millimeter nuts on the top just to keep it from falling out. Just a couple threads is all you need to hold it in there. And then take your drift pin again, shove it into that lower eyelet, get things lined up, feed that 19 millimeter bolt in, give it a little tippy tap with a hammer or an air hammer if you're having a little bit of trouble. And yeah, your shock should be back in. Might take a little levering with this guy to get the clearance again. So now comes the hardest part of the whole install, and that's getting the KDSS sway bar reattached to the lower control arms. If you've followed my advice so far, the sway bar should still be attached at the KDSS ram and the chassis mount. If you disconnected those, reconnect those at this point. The next thing that I would advise is checking the threads on your hardware, both the lower control arm and the bolt itself. See how easily that threads in. If it's kind of nasty, take a tap and die and clean those up. It's a M12 by 1.25. My tap and die kit did not have that, so what I did was put a little tap magic lube on there and run the bolt in and out of the threads a couple times, and then cleaned off the grunge. Don't tell anyone. And then you're going to need one more weird tool on the day, and that is the trusty ratchet strap. So you probably have one of these lying around, probably use it to tie stuff down to a trailer, whatever. You're going to want to wrap that around the lower control arm and the KDSS bar to pull them closer together. Once they're close together, you can take your trusty drift pin again, shove that into the notch that we talked about earlier, lever down, get those hooks around the bottom of the KDSS bracket, and then lever up and get your hardware fed through. So from there, it's pretty straightforward. Reattach your ball joints, run your cotter pins through. Maybe you got new cotter pins if you were actually thinking ahead. Might need to jack up the lower control arm to help bring up that spindle so that the upper control arm ball joint goes on easier. Put on that 10 millimeter ABS bracket, put your wheels back on, lower it to the ground, and hopefully your day was shorter than mine. So I guess to wrap up, I wanted to mention a few things that didn't work for me in my situation, and maybe they'll work for you if you have shorter coilovers that are like the stock length and you're not installing like the top trim spacer. But the first one was Toytech has a video where they leave the lower control arms connected and disconnect the KDSS ram and the KDSS chassis mount with that little arm. And then they reconnect it using like some leverage to jack up the KDSS bar. For me, like I could not get my coilovers out with the sway bar end links still attached, even with the ram and the chassis mount disconnected. So that was kind of a dead end for me. Second, I've seen a video where a tech doesn't undo any connections for the KDSS system and gets that driver side coil out and then puts a jack under the KDSS ram to try to lever down the passenger side. Again, like I could not get my shocks out without disconnecting the sway bar end links. But I think it's been like that every time that I've done this now. Over a 6-year time period, I've done this 5 times, and I think every time I've just had to take the long way. Like there's no shortcut. Just really have to take those sway bar end links off and ratchet them back on later. And then third, on the Westcott Designs video, they're working with a non-KDSS truck where it's like one bolt, sway bars off, you're off to the races. And they've got a lift, and so they've got great access underneath where they can reach the inner lower control arm mounts to the chassis. And man, that looks like a really fast, really efficient way if you've got a lift to put your truck on. But if you're working on the ground like me, it's kind of awkward to get the angles right and like to try to get enough torque to torque those lower control arms back in there. So I tried that method last time, and it just seemed like more work than the method that I've outlined here. So let me know if I've missed something. I'd honestly love to know some secret that I'm not doing or I'm doing wrong that could make this even faster, because even though I think this is my last time getting in there, man, it just seems like there's always something that I want to tweak. So and then I guess if you've made it this far, maybe think about doing a like and subscribe. Check out some of the other videos on the channel. I'm starting to do more tech stuff like this, but what got me started was making series. We actually took this 4Runner over to Iceland and lived out of it for a month, and then last summer I drove out to Newfoundland solo. So if you like 4Runners, wheeling, exploring, should be cool content for you. So yeah, I'll see you in the next one.